Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome back to part 2 in my reevaluation reread of Cormac McCarthy's The Border Trilogy. This was in part inspired by a long conversation that Steve Donoghue and I have been having about DudeBro lit and revolving particularly around Cormac McCarthy and his work, which kind of inspired me to go back and read The Border Trilogy, which includes the novels All the Pretty Horses, The Crossing, which I'm going to be talking about today, and then the third volume is Cities of the Plains. Of those three, All the Pretty Horses is the most famous, and I think it is probably the book that made McCarthy into a more recognized, popular writer, got him onto Oprah and things like that. And so I wanted to reevaluate those in part, to go back and reread them and think and see if I thought as highly of them the second time through as I thought about them the first time through, and does, of course, age play a role in my evaluation of the novels. And then kind of just in a kind of a fun way to see if they do meet the 7 characteristics of DudeBro criteria that Steve Donoghue created. So just a couple of things before I get started. I'll leave a timestamp to where I start kind of a run through of the plot, because there are going to be some spoilers in that section, and if you're interested in reading The Crossing, you may want to skip over those. I tried to find a way to take them out, but there's no way to take probably the biggest kind of plot point out of my discussion without then preventing me from talking about kind of the literary merit, such as it is, of the book. So I'll leave a timestamp down below so you can see where that started, and I will save all the DudeBro lit discussion until the very end. I'll give an evaluation of the book, and then I'll, how much I like the book, and then I'll do the DudeBro stuff at the end. So if you want to skip the DudeBro stuff because you're tired of hearing me talk about DudeBro lit, Roz, I'm talking about you, then you can just miss that part and just read or just watch the part about the review. So I always tell people, and it always told people when asked, about my favorite Cormac McCarthy books, if it's specifically about the Border Trilogy, I always gave the answer, The Crossing, and this is one reason, and to be honest with you, one of the reasons why I wanted to reread these books is so I could get to this one specifically, because I did kind of place it on a fairly high level in terms of books that I really liked. And for the first part of the book is divided, I think, into 4 big sections. For the first part of the book, it's about 135, 136 pages. My evaluation and feeling about the book, I still think was absolutely right. I think that first section is truly good. I truly like it. And that's probably what my memory, and I guarantee you that's what my memory of the book is. As a matter of fact, if you'd probably asked me, I would have told you that the book more or less ended where section 1 ended, which kind of speaks a lot, I think, about the other sections of the book. So for me, that first 135, 136 pages are really good, and I'll just tell you, you could read that as a novella and probably walk away pretty happy. But sections 2, 3, and 4 are, to me, a lot less even. Particularly in sections 2 and 3, I think McCarthy is trying to invest the novel with some kind of philosophical or larger or important meaning or import, which really kind of, I think, ruins what could have been a fairly interesting and oftentimes beautifully described, fairly straightforward adventure story by trying to give it more meaning, by McCarthy trying, I think, in my personal opinion, to go back to some of what he was trying to get at in Blood Meridian. As a matter of fact, some of the sections and some of the parts of section 2 and 3 of The Crossing just feels to me like he had some images, some scenes, some characters that he wanted to introduce into Blood Meridian, but he couldn't make them work in that narrative, and so he put them here. And so to me, it's uneven. And if you're, just to give a real quick thing, my opinion of the book is that it's uneven and lots of the parts of the book fail. But that first 135 pages are, to me, really solid and really pretty good. So here it is. This is the plot summary part. This is where the spoilers will show up. And it's a pretty long book, and a lot of stuff happens, so I'm going to try to go through these things really quickly. Our main character is Billy Parham. He lives on, a relatively poor farm in southern New Mexico, of course, right near the border with Mexico, because that's what the crossing refers to. He lives there with his mom and his dad and his little brother, Boyd. And from the youngest time in his life, he's been obsessed with wolves. Wolves are kind of his thing when he was a kid. So when a wolf begins threatening the cattle ranching areas around where he lives and killing calves, he and his father set out to trap this wolf, and ultimately Billy traps the wolf. But rather than killing the wolf to sell it for its pelt or for its reward and bring money to the family, he figures out and contrives a way to capture the wolf, and he decides to take it with him to Mexico. He's going to return it to the mountains of Mexico, from whence he believes it came, rather than killing it. And I don't think I have to go into, what that probably symbolizes in the book. He goes to Mexico. He doesn't tell his family he's going. He just takes his horse and whatever supplies he had with him, and the wolf, and he just heads off to Mexico. He runs into various groups of people. Eventually, some local authorities arrest him. They take the wolf from him, and they're going to use the wolf in a really protracted, long dogfighting scenario, which more or less is the climax of Section 1. After that, in Section 2, Billy wanders through northern Mexico, has various adventures, meets all kinds of people, and has all kinds of encounters, and he's starving, and he's hungry, and he goes into a ruined town whose only resident is an ex-priest who tells him a story of a Job-like figure who lost his faith in God and who caused the priest to lose his faith himself. I'm telling you, that section is really long. At some point, he returns home, and he finds out when he gets home that his mother and father have been murdered and their horses have been stolen, and his younger brother Boyd is living with a local family. He picks up his younger brother Boyd. They arm themselves, and they take horses, and they go south seeking vengeance against the people who killed his parents and trying to get the horses back. So he and Billy and Boyd Parham now cross the border. Ooh, I moved the camera there. Now cross the border to Mexico. They find the horses. They get the horses. They rescue a girl. They lose the horses. They have the horses taken from them. Some people help them. Some people hurt them. They end up killing a man. They're on the run. Boyd and the girl fall in love. Boyd gets shot. Billy goes off with the girl. Billy tracks him down, gets him a doctor, saves him. Then Boyd runs off with the girl again. Billy goes back to the United States of America. He attempts to join the army because World War II has just started, but because he has a heart murmur, they won't take him in the army. Eventually, he goes back to Mexico in search of his brother Boyd, and I guess vengeance and horses, and he meets a man who was blinded during the Mexican Revolution, and he hears his really long story. He eventually, learns that his brother has been killed. He recovers his brother's body. He attempts to bring his brother's remains back to the United States. He meets some gypsies. He hears a weird story about an airplane up in the mountains. And he struggles, but eventually he gets his brother's body home and buries it. There you go. That's the plot. And if that seemed confusing and uneven and disjointed, well, to me that's kind of what the book is. This book, I think, makes it even more clear that what McCarthy is doing here, and this is obvious, but it's even more obvious after having read the second book. You would pick up on this, having read All the Pretty Horses, is that McCarthy sees the United States and Mexico on two different points in the scale of civilization. That the United States has become too civilized for men to practice their manly skills in manly ways, and therefore if they want to practice those skills, if they want to hold on to the manlier past, there's no escaping this idea, by the way, I don't think. They hold on to the manlier past, they have to go to Mexico, which is still relatively uncivilized, and there they can try to use their skills to survive, and they're tested, and they either pass or fail that kind of test in Mexico. That is kind of, to me, the overall theme of the Border Trilogy novels. As I said before, my personal opinion, this book is very uneven as a coherent story that makes sense. All the Pretty Horses is much better. If All the Pretty Horses is a book that's more often read and a book that won awards and a book that made McCarthy more famous, then I think that's deservedly so, because as a coherent storyline book, a book that takes a plot and moves from point A to point B in a relatively logical way with a minimum of, existentially, philosophically important moments and symbolism, then All the Pretty Horses is a much more coherent book. This one is a mishmash of ideas, and it's really, I think, kind of uneven. There are long sections of the book where we hear the stories of being told to Billy, the story of the man, the Job-like figure, and the priest, the story of the man who was blinded, the stories told by these gypsies. We get all these storytelling moments which are supposed to have meaning and are supposed to be symbolic, and I suppose they are, but they are also, were to me as a reader, fairly trying, and they were wearying. And I really think that prevents the book from being, on the whole, a success, even though I still do love that first 135 pages. As always with McCarthy, I think the writing is sometimes incredibly beautiful and well done, and sometimes it's just sloppy, so I thought I would read you a passage where I thought it was good, and this is from really near the beginning, because, that's kind of where I was paying most attention to, do I like this writing? Is this writing good or bad? This is essentially where we learn about Billy's kind of obsession with wolves as a youth. So I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs here. This is Billy has snuck out to watch wolves running in the wild. Again, how probable that is for a really young kid to do, like a kid under the age of 7 or 8 to do. Well, it is fiction. So here we go, in describing the wolves. They were running on the plain, harrying the antelope, and the antelope moved like phantoms in the snow, and circled and wheeled, and the dry powder blew about them in the cold moonlight, and their breath smoked palely in the cold as if they burned with some inner fire, and the wolves twisted and turned and leapt in a silence such as they seemed of another world entire. All one sentence. And this is where, in terms of McCarthy, I'm going to interrupt myself here. This is where, in terms of McCarthy style, I think that kind of hurried, rushed, mashed together, run-on sentence style works, because he's describing action. And when he's doing that, I think it works. Continuing on. They moved down the valley and turned and moved far out on the plain until they were the smallest of figures in that dim whiteness, and then they disappeared. He was very cold. He waited. He was very still. He could see by his breath how the wind lay, and he watched his breath appear and vanish and appear and vanish constantly before him in the cold, and he waited a long time. Then he saw them coming, loping and twisting, dancing, tunneling their noses in the snow, loping and running and rising by twos in a standing dance and running on again. I just think there is, and you don't have to agree, this is to me a stylistic thing. I think there's a beauty in the way in which the rhythm of those sentences work, in the speed of part of it, in the slowness of the waiting. In the part where he's talking about waiting, the sentences are short. They have kind of repetitive nature, as though you are waiting for time to pass. And then we go back to the action of the wolves. I think that worked really well, and I actually think that is great writing, and I enjoyed that a lot. So then there are also just sections where I think McCarthy is sloppy, so I'm just going to read you one of those. This is when Billy is going to try to find somebody who can help him catch the wolf, or teach him how to catch the wolf. The old man was in a dark cell of a room at the back of the house. The room smelled of wood smoke and kerosene and sour bedding. The boy stood in the doorway and tried to make him out. He turned and looked back, but the woman had gone on to the kitchen. He stepped down into the room. There was an iron bedstead in the corner. A figure, small and dark, prone upon it. The room smelled as well of dust or clay, as if it might be that which the old man smelled of. But then even the floor of the room was mud. Okay, so this is an example where I just don't think McCarthy's writing makes sense. If you're in a room which smells of wood smoke, which is an all-encompassing smell. It's very hard to smell anything else. And kerosene does have an odor, and a sour bedding definitely has an odor, and this may seem silly, but I just doubt very much you could smell clay or dust in a room that smelled of wood smoke and kerosene and sour bedding. Anyway, that's just where I think it's sloppy, and where, maybe McCarthy could have used an editor to say, hey, I don't think this exactly works. So, in the last video, when I was talking about All the Pretty Horses, I kind of described McCarthy as a magpie and kind of borrowing ideas and stylistic things from other writers. And I think in this book, it's even more pronounced and even more obvious. The whole wolf thing, I mean, if you read a book about a man, a boy, and a wolf, or a wolf at all who seems to be a character, you can't help but go Jack London. In the last section where Billy's trying to bring his brother's body home, this is a clear reference to, and the struggles he has, with the body coming unwrapped and, all kinds of bad things happening. It's a clear reference to Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, and certainly Faulkner is an influence on McCarthy. There's even possibility that McCarthy's been influenced by the last part of Lonesome Dove, but mainly the influence I see on this book is from Gabriel Garcia Marquez. There's definitely, to me, a kind of 100 Years of Solitude feel about this. There are, there are tales of woe, ghostly encounters, people who seem to stand between the world of the living and the dead and understand both. There's this weird story about trying to retrieve an airplane lost in the mountains, one of two. And there are even gypsies, which if you've read 100 Years of Solitude, gypsies play a role in that book as well. And so this kind of leads me to, kind of question McCarthy. I think all writers borrow from others, borrow ideas, borrow stylistic things. I think that's normal, but in this book it felt a little bit more like, almost that McCarthy is copying ideas, creating, if you will, a hodgepodge of ideas, that he's copying other people's ideas and rebranding them as his own in this kind of Western world. So there you go. For me, the book is, on the whole, a failure. I just don't think it coheres together well, and I think it tries to be too symbolic and too philosophical when it could have been a perfectly good kind of Western adventure story with some symbolism and some philosophical ideas in it. So this is where the DudeBro Lit part starts. So this is where I'm going to evaluate the crossing based on Steve Donoghue's 7 characteristics of DudeBro Lit. So the first 2 characteristics of DudeBro Lit are related. Characteristic 1, which Steve says is a feature of all DudeBro Lit works, is that it's misogynistic, and then characteristic 2 is it's sexist. By misogynistic, what Steve means is that female characters are kind of archetypal characters. They are either scolds, or they're mysterious and unknowable, or they're seductresses, or they're some combination of those 3. I would add a category to that list that Steve made. I would add the drudge, the woman who serves no purpose other than to serve men. I would add the drudge as kind of the, if I'm using that word right, as kind of another archetypal character. And in terms of, is this book misogynistic by that standard? Yes. The only female character who really has any pages devoted to her, the only real female character in the book, is the girl that Billy and Boyd rescue, who falls in love with Boyd, and who literally then seduces him and leads him away from the quest to get vengeance for their parents' death and to find their horses. She literally leads him astray, as it were. And that is, if that's what we're gonna call misogynistic writing, then that's true. In addition to that, it's sexist, and what Steve calls sexist is that we never really understand the interior lives of any of the female characters, that they are essentially two-dimensional, that the only purpose they serve is to move the plot along or to be points of conflict, and they themselves aren't really characters. And again, that is true. We get no glimpse or insight into the mind of this girl who falls in love with Boyd. All we know about her is some kind of sketchy, orphan-like family history, and that she loves Boyd and that she resents Billy. Well, that's pretty That's pretty two-dimensional. Now, in fairness, the only character we really get a glimpse of their interior life is Billy, the main character, and to a certain extent his brother Boyd. But by those two standards, yes, misogynistic, according to these standards, in that women are reduced to these kind of archetypal characters that we run into over and over again, and sexist, and that we don't see into their interior lives, absolutely. Again, on Steve's scale, characteristic 3 and 4 of DudeBro Lit are related. DudeBro Lit uses inventory, a list of items and things, instead of actual description of what's going on. The answer to that is yes. This book contains a lot of description of just things. Every time somebody lights a cigarette and how they light it. Every time somebody does something involving horses or building a fire or trapping an animal, it is described in this kind of inventory type detail, and then the fourth characteristic, which is related to that, is that inventory imparted by the author with some kind of talismanic meaning about lost ideas of manhood and lost values in which men were men and did manly things. And again here, that's definitely true. Just even in that first section, the section I like the most, the story of how Billy actually essentially captures, muzzles, and leashes the wolf is told in incredible detail. I'm not sure what he does is actually possible, but it's told in incredible detail so that you get some appreciation for the kind of skills that Billy has, and the kind of inherent manliness of those skills. Even his desire to return the wolf against all odds is kind of a manly quest that he's going on. And then, just to give you another example from the section that I do like the most, the process of trapping a wolf and preparing the traps and what kind of traps you need and where you would set them out and how you would cover them is described in real depth of detail, in part, I think, to give you some idea that these are men who knew things that today we've lost. And the idea is that we've lost those things to our detriment. The last three characteristics on Steve's characteristics of DudeBro Lit are also, I think, kind of really closely related. Characteristic 5, he says, reading the book mimics playing a video game. Well, maybe. If you like to play open world video games in which there is no appreciable action for really long periods of time, then yes. It is a quest story, and here's where I begin to have problems. I may have mentioned this before with Steve's characteristics. 1 through 4 I think are pretty solid, and I would say that's a pretty good way of evaluating if something's DudeBro Lit or not, those first 4 things. But to be honest with you, can't we say that almost all adventure stories kind of fall into this video game style of story? I mean, Lord of the Rings works exactly in that way. And I don't think Steve would necessarily call Lord of the Rings DudeBro Lit. It would fail in some of their other areas. But it kind of works in that way, where the characters don't kind of move from one adventure, one action scene to another. I don't think there's any way around that. And so to me, that's not a particularly good evaluator of DudeBro Lit. Characteristic number 6 is it's not meant to be read as literature. It's all about adrenaline and shock and surprise. And there's no literary nuance or thought. In this book, I would say the answer is no, as is for number 5, because there's just so long between the action. I don't see how it could be mimicking playing a video game. But for number 6, I would also say no, this isn't really DudeBro Lit. If anything, there's too much emphasis, too much effort put into making the book literary. Too much effort put into creating these purely literary, symbolically important scenes. So I'm going to say for characteristic 6, no, it's not DudeBro Lit. And then characteristic 7, which is related to 5 and 6, is that books like this are an addiction. They give you an adrenaline rush when you read them. It's not appealing to the part of your brain where you appreciate literature. It's a part only appealing to kind of your adrenaline-driven part of your brain. I would say here, on the contrary, again, this book has serious literary intentions. And if anything, I think reading The Crossing would force you either A, to want to understand what all this literary stuff is about, or B, it forces you to think about literature and other things you've read. when evaluating it. So I would say it fails to be DudeBro lit on characteristics 5, 6, and 7. But in terms of being misogynistic and sexist, according to the way Steve described them, yes. In terms of using inventory instead of description, it definitely does that. In terms of, using that inventory to carry some kind of meaning about lost manliness, it definitely does. So in that way, I would think in the 4 most important characteristics of DudeBro lit, which I think are 1 through 4, yes, it qualifies as DudeBro lit in a way, by the way, which All the Pretty Horses didn't. If you go back and watch that review, I didn't say that All the Pretty Horses was DudeBro lit, but I do think The Crossing probably is, based on those first four characteristics, and then the last 3, I just don't think are. I understand what Steve means, and I do see how, DudeBro lit, which doesn't have any literary pretensions even, to use that word, could fall into that category. But, to me that just, and I've said this before, that just sounds like a Western or an adventure story. So, there you go. There's my evaluation of The Crossing by Cormac McCarthy. The first 135 or so pages, section 1, I think are very good. I liked it very much. It still is some of my favorite Cormac McCarthy writing, but on the whole it's kind of uneven, and I don't think that it necessarily works as a story or as some kind of deep, symbolic, philosophical track. There you go. There's my reevaluation of The Crossing. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below, and as always, thank you for watching.